complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Wade Stotts, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on. I'll be sure to link it, but you and I have been in talks for a while, but you released a short 6-minute video just about politicization. Why is everything so political? It was an absolute masterwork. So I want to start off by saying, one, I can't recommend that enough. And two, it's probably best to just jump straight into this. How do you define politics?
Yeah, well, the video basically is an outgrowth of just me wanting to talk about and think about Carl Schmitt's essay, The Concept of the Political. And I use an analogy early on that his main framing is in terms of friends and enemies, about that friend-enemy distinction. And early on in the video, I use an illustration that, like, imagine you're a part of this Amish community. You've built this thing. You've got families that are living there. And then one day drives up this gentleman in a Range Rover, and his Range Rover is just shaking with rap beats. And he comes in with his husband, and he says that he wants to move in, and don't worry, like, he wants to move in. He wants to at least like put his house on the same land as yours. Well, that is when things got political. So you've got this way of life that people wanted to build that took some effort and was really valuable, at least valuable to the people there. And then you have a threat to that way of life coming in. At least somebody who wants to do things different shows up, and that's when things for them become political. So they're obviously, maybe within that Amish community, there are people who do things differently, and but at bottom they have a basic assumption about how the community should work, how life is, whether there's a God, just basic level stuff. And then somebody comes in who is fundamentally a threat to that way of life. And that is a political situation. Friend, enemy, clear. And it's nice when it's clear. But yeah, that is at least Carl Schmitt's. It's my analogy, but it's the principle of friend, enemy, as Schmitt says it. At least I hope I'm being faithful to his formulation.
And I think that, you hear lefties all the time say, the personal is political. Everything is political. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of right and wrong in that, depending on your definition. Yeah. If they mean in the Aristotelian sense, right, that man is a political animal, that's sort of how humans organize themselves. And, whether it's a church committee or, your local school board, there's always an element of politics to it. Well, that's correct, right? But when we're talking about friends and enemies, right, when it comes to a situation in which, there are mutually incompatible views of how to live when it comes down to things, right? Like, are you Amish or are you a gay rap aficionado, right? That is not entirely true, right? That is something that is, while always a part of like human organization, the fact that it is everywhere and spreading is a relatively recent phenomenon. Like, you see this, right, with the when it comes to, the nature of, man and woman. Like Americans have always enjoyed, shall we say, vigorous politics, right? There've been fights, there've been murders, there've been riots, basically going back to the start of this country. But if you actually look at what is up for debate there, what is considered part of the dialectic, it's relatively narrow. Mm-hmm. Graded on the scale that includes what is a man, what is a woman, is it okay for my kid to chop his dick off, right? Like, okay, obviously that's an extreme example. And so I think that, when I hear people say like, oh, why are things so political? And you get that smarmy, well, everything's political, I'll have you know. I just want to reach to the screen and give them a wedgie, because it's like, it's not what they mean, you moron.
Right. And if everything is political in the friend-enemy sense, then you're not in a healthy place. So if you mentioned church committees and school boards and things like that, if everybody there wants the same things for these kids, they just disagree about means, that's a great, you can have profitable discussions about what the next steps are. But if they don't, if they want different kinds of people, so if by the end of this school, if you're on a school board, by the end of this school experience, you guys have two different contradictory aims for these kids, then yeah, that is not a healthy school board. You should probably like either like kick people out, start your own school. Something needs to happen that is not, again, just more discussion.
Well, certainly. And I think that this is, you see this idea in kind of the difference between first and second order disagreements. So I have and it will actually release after this one chronologically, but I have an episode recorded with Kryptos, and he talks about the difference between first and second order disagreements. And part of that also applies to where do you place authority, right? If you, within that group, right, for instance, like let's take the school board, have a disagreement on, okay, should the kids, should they have lunch in fourth period or fifth period, right? Something that's relatively inconsequential. But you are looking to the same ultimate sources of authority, right? Whether that's a religious system, a system of politics. But, two things separate that from kind of the second order, right? Which is one, the level of what is up for debate. Again, if it is something much more fundamental, we're not even pulling in the same direction. But things get especially nasty if you get to the point where people do not agree on, sovereignty. They do not agree on who decides in those cases. And you've seen this very explicitly with the Supreme Court, right? That kind of the Supreme Court has been the de facto sovereign in America for plus or minus 100 years, right? When something fishy comes up, when something that we can't normally decide through legislation, or the left decides will not be allowed to be decided by legislation, right? Which are sort of different things. It goes to the Supreme Court. But what we're seeing is, right, is that the Supreme Court loses its political utility, right, specifically to the left. There's been this move to deny its legitimacy, right? We need to reform the Supreme Court. We need to pack it with judges. And so I see that, again, as another symptom of that fact that this is not a healthy polity. The level of politicization we see is far beyond just how humans work in a normal society.
Right. Yeah. And people for a long time thought that we could disagree about ultimate issues and still get everything done in some sort of pragmatic way. It was all just a matter of we all want a healthy country. We may disagree about, again, fundamentally what a healthy country is, but let's all keep talking about it. And at a certain level, yeah, you've got, like, if you recognize the difference between sort of ideological politics or debate style politics, and start talking in terms of friends and enemies, then yeah, you can afford to recognize, again, that we're not in some kind of we're not having the kind of disagreements that can be settled. There are disagreements that can be settled through debate, but that depends on a foundational level. Like I said, in the illustration about the Amish community, I'm sure that in any community, you have people who want to do things a little different. There may be people who are, everybody who's involved in a project has differences in approach. And those things can be sort of, like if somebody's building a barn, if an Amish community is building a barn, then they may disagree about certain things, but they're not going to disagree on what they're using to measure everything. And as soon as you do, if somebody's using feet, somebody's using millimeters, and nobody's translating, then you're not going to get much done. And you're just going to end up recognizing, okay, we either need to work on separate projects here or somebody's going to win.
And I think that, that idea of somebody is going to win, right, where you can't sort of stay in this tension forever is something that we've all been feeling on kind of a gut level. Right, that this feeling that everyone's waiting for the other shoe to drop, right, where this level of tension is unsustainable, is something that even if you can't necessarily point to it on a graph, is something that a lot of people have identified. So one of the things you'll hear from conservatives of an older stripe, right, kind of more Chamber of Commerce Republicans, people who are oftentimes stereotyped as baby boomers, is they will lay the blame for this politicization at the feet of Trump. Do you see Trump as being responsible for this?
He's responsible for something. I think that there absolutely was a shift. But it's not that he came in and turned everything political. So a lot of people just noticed, I'll come back to the question, but a lot of people noticed that politicization after Trump, and they also noticed it first in their particular area. So journalists noticed it there, writers noticed it in publishing. Publishing became much more divided after Trump and that kind of thing. But those forces were around. The battle was happening. It was just happening in a way where nobody could really talk about it. Everybody could just paper over. Everybody could paper over the differences at a fundamental level. But Trump was just the guy who, like I say in the video, recognized he was in a fight and started punching back. So if you're in a polite debate discussion and somebody starts punching, then yeah, the guy just broke the rules of the debate and he's not going to, he shouldn't win. But everybody got shocked when Trump started punching back. And he just recognized, oh, somebody's punching at me. I think I'll take another shot. And so that exposed a lot of the enmity that was already there. So CNN didn't become a partisan garbage TV network after Trump pointed out that it was. He was able to point a lot of that out in the GOP. He was able to, and like the way that the GOP functions in relation to power. Those things were around before Trump. He pointed it out, and then people started acting like that was the case. And like I said, people noticed it where they were hanging out first. But usually what people will say is, hey, whatever happened to my friends, if somebody works in publishing, they say, whatever happened to my friends in publishing who were fine with publishing, Pat Buchanan had a big book that was published by a huge New York house. Whatever happened to that kind of thing? Well, the people who were there just followed their own arguments. They followed their own premises, and you just didn't. And that's how you ended up sort of feeling like you stayed in the same place and everybody else changed. But really, it was just because everybody became more consistent.
I think also we need to address the idea of playing by the rules, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because you'll hear people complain, and they've been complaining my entire life that, the left doesn't play by the rules. And that's true. It's completely true. But the problem is, like, okay, you recognized that. What is your course of action? And if your course of action is to keep playing by the rules, you're setting yourself up to lose. And losing, and this goes back to the kind of political conflict we're in. Losing doesn't just mean you lose an election, right? You have to see someone on the TV that you don't like for 4 years. It means, and this goes back to your analogy about the gay couple in Amish country. It will be very difficult, if not impossible, to live your life as you see fit. And you see this in the explicit malice that the left has for people like you and I, Wade, right? They will do things that are spiteful to screw us over because they kind of like it. They get off on it. And you see that in the way that obviously COVID was handled, where you could not go to church, but you could go to the strip club. You see that in the way that they delight in hosting drag time story hours in conservative areas. They love whenever a conservative says something bad enough, quote unquote, for them to get fired. And, if you look at that and say, well, they're doing that, they're swinging hard, but it would be undignified for us to do it. Well, you're condemning yourself to being a loser. And if you're playing a game with the intention to lose, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah. Right. Well, and if there were, so back to the Amish thing, let's say that gay couple comes up and so the Amish people say, no, you may not come in here. We just won't allow that kind of thing. This is the life that we want to set up, and you need to find somewhere else. Then imagine the gay couple comes back and says, well, what if we did a debate, right? What if in the center of your town square, we were able to defend our way of life and you defend your way of life, and we'll see who wins. Well, what happens is you've got two contradictory things, and now that's a sort of wedge into your like a friends only space. So you welcome that in, and then all of a sudden, okay, well, people are considering it now. It becomes an option for people to think through. It becomes an option of a way of life. And yeah, that's like, if the Amish community agrees to that, then yes, they are trying to lose. And the reason that like, I say this in the video, but like the reason that Mitt Romney, the reason that John McCain and those folks were allowed to debate and weren't they were treated poorly and called all kinds of names for stupid reasons. But the reason they were allowed to continue on in the process is because they weren't a threat to leftist power. They weren't a threat to any real organization or real group of power. So when Trump comes in, Trump is a threat to power, and they have no idea how to respond to it. And so everybody amps it up. It is. And so if somebody goes, hey, I want to return back to normal, I want to return back to when everybody played by the rules, or at least the right tried to play by the rules. It is a matter of, then the question becomes, who made the rules? Are they good rules? And should we follow them? There are obviously good ways of talking. Like, there are rules of engagement, but there are different ways of operating if you are in an existential battle for survival than if you're in a polite debate society where everybody gets to make their points and then we all clap or vote at the end to see who wins.
Definitely. I think that, this idea of kind of like playing by the rules and being respectable, is something that the right is going to have to just get over fully. Because, what you see is that, the only way to get the approval of the regime is to kneel fully and totally. And any kind of like mealy-mouthed halfway compromise at best only kind of forestalls the inevitable. And you see this in the sense that, people who I have a negative opinion of because of their willingness to cancel others. So let's go with someone like Dinesh D'Souza, right? Infamously canceled Sam Francis. He did that, right? Which for a short time won him the acclaim of the people on the left, right? Oh, this is a man who's rooting out white supremacy. But does that protect him now? Right? No, of course. He's called the exact same names. Just, despite the fact that he did sell out one of his own. And so even if you don't listen to the moral argument, which is it is wrong to sacrifice your friends for the benefit of your enemies, which I think it is. And perhaps Dante would be in agreement with me. But nonetheless, it's not even effectual. This is not a strategy that works. And so again, right, I think it is imperative to look at politics as kind of the science of what is, not what we would like to be. And don't get me wrong, I wish we lived in a world where politics was narrow, right, where it was confined to kind of these matters of, governance, tax policy, things like that. But that's not the world we live in. And sort of just kind of idly hoping that if we act like that's the case, that will thumb in it, kind of like ghost dancing, right, to just bring back a healthy polity out of nothing. It's unrealistic. It's not how it works. And at a certain point, I kind of look at these people like Charlie Brown, right, where the same exact game plan is being run for, my entire life, your entire life, by all likelihood, our grandparents' entire lives. And the so-called good conservatives keep falling for it, right? They keep trying to kick the football. And there's this sort of logic like, oh, we'll just kick it extra hard this time. Like, we need an especially, well-spoken, articulate candidate who's above reproach. You see people like, look, like I'm not the biggest, like Ben Carson fan in the world, but Ben Carson's not a bad guy, right? He's not some scary individual, but he is made to be that when he becomes a political threat. And so it almost doesn't matter. You could pick the reincarnation of, the mid-century German himself, stick him on the pedestal, and they would react just as extremely if you put, Obama too, but a Republican, right? It effectively doesn't matter. And so does that mean you behave badly? You do things that are morally wrong? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that you don't need to look to these people for approval because they won't give it to you unless you do exactly what they want.
Yeah. And it's not that you've got, so the answer to a bad, so yes, the left has a bad morality of who the good guys and bad guys are, right? But the answer to that is not no morality, and the answer is an alternative morality, the alternative to the leftist one, so that you can judge. Okay, I can judge my people, and I won't allow their standards to determine how I see the people on my side. But I have my own standards, and as long as we're passing those standards, as long as like Especially, I mean, I'm a Christian. I would say, like, if God is pleased with my people and if we're strategically doing the right thing, then I think we're doing great. But if not, then yeah, we'll do some work. We have stuff to do. But I'm not going to be looking to my enemy. My pastor just recently used an example of, like, you shouldn't invite the enemy general to come evaluate your troops. You just shouldn't. It doesn't make any sense. They have different. They're not going to. They're not going to be fair and imbalanced coming over to your side. They're not. It's not an exercise in neutrality to welcome that kind of criticism. And I just think that's a absolutely essential element of strategy moving forward, is not looking to the left, looking to your enemy as to figure out whether you should fire, and not calling ahead to make sure that everybody is ready for you to fire, because that just means that they know you're coming.
Well, and you see that with that idea of, letting the foxes design the chicken coop, right? They're never going to give you a good answer. It's not in their nature. And I think that, that's something we have to realize, is that politics is, war by other means. And I think that the reason that this kind of war has gotten so nasty, that you have people worried about it turning hot. I'm not one of them. I don't really see a civil war as being like a real possibility, but nonetheless, right, tensions have run high. And again, it's because, there is a real deep enmity here. And I think that your point about, when you were faced with evil, and I make the argument that our enemies are evil. They love Satan quite explicitly, right? In the case of the Iowa State House, that, when presented with that, what is the Christian response? Is it to be like, oh, it's fine. I wouldn't want to be rude. No, we have a long tradition of men who reacted strongly. I'll put it that way. And I'm not advocating violence by any means, but I am just saying that, there is no contradiction between Christian morals and saying no to this, right? There is no contradiction between, being a follower of Christ and looking at this and saying, no, I will not permit it. And again, you see, and I'm speaking in the language of, American evangelicals. They are my people, right? There's this idea of, being loving, being winsome. And the thing is about, being loving, right? And this is something that parents will be familiar with. That letting someone do something self-destructive is not loving. It's not in their best interest. And to be honest, the best thing for these people is to have them be stopped, right? They're harming themselves. They're harming others. And I refuse to grant the moral high ground to people who are castrating their own sons. Like, these people are not moral actors. They are not, your moral betters. And anytime you say, like, oh, I don't want to do something that is, too nasty, I don't want to do something embarrassing, right? You are granting them moral legitimacy they do not have. And of course, wait, I'm not talking about you personally, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hey, yeah. And like, it's not an unchristian thing to recognize a threat. So if somebody individually recognizes a threat to their own life, it is okay for that person to evaluate whether this person is a threat and to act on that, to neutralize that threat. It's not like being saved and loving the Bible and loving God doesn't keep you from, like, recognizing, again, natural threats. And back to the point about, like, people who want to go back to normal. There's a sense in which I totally understand that, because I also wish that we lived in a place that had more in common with each other. We all want to live in a place where, yes, we agree on the basics. We agree on the like foundational level issues. Back to your conversation with Kruptas. And now it's just a matter of talking through the details. And we agree on the aims. Let's talk about the means. That's a wonderful kind of place to live in. But I've never lived in that place. And it's important for us to recognize, like you said, maybe our grandparents didn't even live in that place. And so getting back to a point where we thought that we lived in a place where everybody basically held things in common doesn't help. And it also, like, it's like rewinding the movie and expecting a different ending. Things were already headed in this direction. We couldn't see them, but it doesn't mean that going back to a time when we couldn't see them is better. it's like a nostalgia for childhood where you're like, oh, I wish I lived in a time where I didn't know about taxes. I wish I lived in a time where I didn't know about wars. It's like, well, too bad. Like you may have this, you may have this nostalgia for this dream of childhood where all the you were sheltered from a lot of the complicated realities, but it's just not a realistic way of living in the world. And like it's not. And back to the point about Schmidt, where it's not that Schmidt is saying that this is the way things ought to be. Like that political things being political is the way things ought to be. He's just describing the way things are. And so naturally in the world, you're going to see friends, you're going to see enemies. It's a descriptive way of talking about things and not necessarily a prescriptive. So it's better for us to live in light of that than it would be for us to deny that. And again, just kind of relax into this naivete and like, oh, I wish things are, things were better back when I could just zone out and watch TV and and not know what was happening to me.
And I think that is a mode of being you can really only sustain when everyone is on the same page generally. I talk to older people, particularly from the silent generation, and they feel incredibly confused about the fact that, their children and their grandchildren, right, who have kids, right, these are very old people now, have to sift through culture and education with a fine-toothed comb in a way they didn't, right? Like these people who are now in their 90s, when they went through school, it was they just went to school. There was no need to read through the textbooks, right, to see what is going on behind the scenes, because everyone assumed everyone was on the same page. And so you could trust your teacher without really knowing them that they wouldn't try to trans your kid. But now, again, because these political problems have gotten so severe, you have to take an active stance at things. You are not able to be a passive receiver unless you want to effectively go along with this. And I think that it's, again, like you said, it's not an ideal place to be. I'd prefer to live in a polity where, for the most part, everyone has got the same source of authority. Everyone is broadly in agreement. But that's not how it is. And it's the same thing with, and liberals have this problem generally, right? Which is they wish to sort of summon their end goal by acting like it's already here. So the libertarians will say, like, I wish to live in, an ANCAP society, right? Where people have complete freedom. And so I will act like I have complete freedom, not realizing that will in fact produce, this kind of like awful, nanny state bureaucracy we have now. That kind of true inner freedom requires strong social institutions. And I think that it's the same instinct, right? Which is like, oh, I will just stick my head in the sand. I'll just kind of go along to get along, because that's what I would do if we did have a functional society. But that's not how the real world works. And,
right.
The reason I'm going after these people is not because I hate them. It's not. But it's because they are unwittingly allowing themselves to be destroyed by people who do hate them. And I see it as a shame, genuinely, because the best parts of America have effectively been taken advantage of by this like satanic civic religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we want to live, let's say we think, yes, we all agree. We want to live in a place where we agree at a foundational level. I'm not having to think about threats constantly. Yeah, that's if you're literally living in a city where you're having to constantly think about threats, you're not in a healthy city. But if we're going to get there, we have to build it. And we can build it in small ways. We can build it at local levels, thankfully, still now. But recognizing also that is at some point going to be threatened or could be threatened. And if we're going to build the kind of society that everybody agrees at the same level, or, at some level, at the foundational level, then we have to get there, and we have to be comfortable talking about those things. And if we were to go back to the kind of liberal approach, which it sees itself as like the end of friend enemy, sees itself as, well, it doesn't matter what you believe at a foundational level. We're all just here to talk about debate. We're in a debate club. We can't return to that because that will always end up in the same spot. We have to define what a friend is. We have to define what an American is, and we have to at least have something that can. And this goes back to your discussion with Martyr Mate about identity, and that identity, and that being, I think, foundationally, America being like a Protestant nation, America having a Christian foundation, is something that we can't ignore anymore, and we can't really afford. Obviously, that may be a conversation we can have after we win or as we're winning, but we should know what kind of place we want to live in, and that's different from thinking in utopian terms. So, like, libertarians, as you mentioned earlier, or ANCAP folks, tend to talk in utopian terms and then act as if they already live in that utopia. That's exactly right. But if you recognize that, then yes, it's going to take some work, and building the kind of molecular society where we're not just isolated individuals and we're connected in real, tangible ways, many of them unchosen. Then that takes effort, and we've got pockets of that. That's why I have some hope. Is we have families that are doing well, we have church communities that are doing well, and we have lots of launching pads, things that could grow. And there's health. There is real health out there, but it's just we don't have power right now, and it's not the resistance that we have, the resistance that we can bring, will depend on the health of the people who are doing it, and that means communities. That means bonds, like as you talked about with Martyr Mate.
I think that is kind of one of the fundamental lies of liberalism, right? Is that you can put away those questions. They've been referred to, as kind of like the strong gods, right? These things like, race and religion and nationality. And I think that in certain cases, the desire to de-emphasize those was noble. I mean, you see the devastation that, the Reformation brought to Europe, and you can understand why someone would want to say, like, okay, like, keep your creed to yourself. We'll all try to, join together in the marketplace and just not talk about it.
Right.
And I get that. But the problem is that began a slow process of degradation and of atomization. And effectively that started this process of coasting, right? Where we were kind of working off of those assumed kind of prerequisites, right? That, well, no one talks about their specific faith, but we're all broadly Christian. And the problem is, right, if you take away the sort of social enforcement mechanisms to actually like ensure that you act in a broadly Christian way, well, that begins to go away. And I think that, the horror that a lot of people, especially older people, see is that those kind of fumes guttering out. Look, I'm Gen Z, I'm a young guy. And I think that one of the things that makes it easier for people my age to talk about politics in kind of a dispassionate way is that, like, I've, to be honest, never really known an America that worked that well. I remember the Bush era, and from a certain perspective, the Bush era is better than it is now. But I mean, do you want to say that the Bush era was depoliticized? It certainly wasn't. People went nuts on both sides. I mean, and Obama, who I view as like really a villain in this story for what he did. I mean, he just kept swinging away at that crack, right? With comments like, "Oh, Trayvon could have been my son." He called, people like us like bitter hangers on, and really weaponized that. Because again, we lost the fumes of a society where these strong gods, and I'm not talking about literal gods, forgive me a poetic phrase, were still active. And I think that, there's no way to get out of this without those things coming back. And certainly some of that might be ugly. But the problem is, right, we are dealing with humans. And at least I'm of the opinion that human nature is a relative constant. And things like these unchosen bonds are a part of humanity. And we ignore them at our peril.
No. Yeah, I totally agree. It really is a question of reasserting humanity and nature, such that like many of the deepest things about us are things that we didn't choose. I didn't choose where I was born. I didn't choose my chromosomes. I didn't choose who my parents were. And so a lot of liberalism becomes fighting against all of those. And so you just try to cut away every kind of attachment, and then you find out who you truly are, which is the message of all kinds of terrible fiction. But we bought it, and since we bought it, we've come to think of things we didn't choose as being supreme, such that I get to choose my identity, I get to choose my gender. But yeah, lack of decision about a thing doesn't mean that it's not good for you. And inherent in that is some amount of authority and some amount of taking your leadership from nature, from what God made you, where he put you, and just going, all right, this is where he's put me. This is the time he's put me in. And I'm not going to, instead of rebelling against that, because it's not going to go anywhere, accepting that and being grateful for it, and gratitude for the body that God gave you, the parents that God gave you, the place where he put you. And that I think is the answer to like thinking that you can just look at all your options in the world and then pick them. Chesterton talked about how like Rome wasn't Rome. Like, yeah, there's the famous quote, and I'm missing it right now. But Rome wasn't. Men didn't love Rome because Rome was great. It was great because men loved her, and it was great because they wanted to make it great. They loved it, and then it turned into something good. And that's something that we can do too. And if we can love those unchosen bonds and love the place where we are, love the family that we have, then we can start to build something great.
I think that you're 100% right. And if you didn't bring up that Chesterton quote, I would have. And
you probably could have quoted it right.
Yeah, fair enough, right? But one of the things that you see, and it's difficult, right? Because in some way, right, the kind of neo-pronouns and the like gender identity stuff and transhumanism, which are kind of connected, right, is the ultimate expression of that idea of like radical personal choice, right? Which is I am what I define. And I think that, this is something that we as right-wing Americans really need to talk about, because we've been presented this idea of America as a propositional nation, right? Where you become an American because of the beliefs in your heart. And, you may like that sentiment, but the problem is it's the same core premise, right? I decide what I am. And the problem is it's very difficult to freeze that logic in place. It's very difficult to say like, oh yes, well, you can define X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C. That's completely off limits. And I find this kind of struggle in my own life, where on one hand, like I'm a son of the American tradition. I don't like being told what to do. But if I really dig down into it, that kind of infectious idea of I decide is something that I think we have to examine. And it all goes down to, again, like you said, those unchosen bonds. And if you look at young people, it is very clear that they lack an identity, right? Social media is basically a platform for people to construct their own identity, right? The neo-pronouns, the like Z's that we like to make fun of. That's really something that only can exist on something like social media, where you actually can put your pronouns in bio, right? But it speaks to a space in which you can completely construct your identity, right? Completely independently of those unchosen bonds.
Right.
And so I see that idea as one that's very, very far along. It's very advanced, hopefully, nearing its end. But I think that it's something we have to address and perhaps even look at our own lives, right? Look at the ways that we have embodied that same idea, just slightly behind the curve, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and the back to the point about politicization, mass media has you talked about TikTok and pronouns and bio and stuff like that. That has really accelerated the extent to which places that used to unite people. So if you're in the same neighborhood or you go to the same school, there used to be some amount of camaraderie, even if there were cliques and even if that kind of thing. But because everybody there is being influenced or fed different like Instagram reels and TikToks, then they can build an entire like philosophy of life, an entire way of thinking about the world, such that friends and enemies are right next door to each other, going to the same school, sitting next to each other constantly. And like I said, that is mass media creates, maybe it doesn't inevitably create, I'll leave that discussion to smarter people than me, but it does create this, this politicization and pushes it down to the point where it's neighbors, friends, family, and yeah, that lack of health. If a human body is fighting off a disease at every single level, that's no good. If the cancer is small, you can cut it out, get rid of it. But if it spreads, then the treatment, as we were talking about earlier, the treatment is going to have to be much more drastic, and you just hope that the treatment doesn't kill you before the disease does.
Definitely. And I think that is, just kind of like by constitution, I'm not exactly an optimistic guy. And I think that part of that is looking at that problem, right? That kind of like advanced cancer, and realizing there's no really easy way out of this. There's no kind of like quick 3-step plan to have everyone like each other again. And like, don't get me wrong, I'm not a full on doom and gloom, it's all over. But at the same time, I think that that's a sobering realization that, on our watch, we've allowed an immense amount of destruction, right? Both physical destruction, and also the social fabric is frayed. We do not have any semblance of group identity anymore. And obviously, there are forces that are actively working against us. Mass migration is certainly one of them. But I think that we need to realize that, those things are necessary to have a functional civilization. And albeit less and less, we do have a society that functions at a certain level, right? Like I can, press a few keys and have something delivered to my house. But that relies on a relatively cohesive social fabric. And so I spoke to a man recently from South Africa. And it's interesting that, when a social fabric goes, it really goes. And does that mean that it's Mad Max? No, albeit I would argue South Africa is relatively close to Mad Max compared to America, at least. But those kind of nice things we take for granted, like, oh, I can have a package on my front doorstep and it will be there when I get home from work, or I can let a contractor into my house to fix something and he won't, rob me blind and disappear. Again, if the social fabric goes and completely frays, those things that we kind of take for granted go with it. And a lot of the kind of quality of life Americans enjoy is really built on being a high trust society, a society where you can, depend on the behavior of your fellow man.
Yeah. And we're to the point that enmity is so to the point that now we disagree as to whether people are a good thing. So all the things that you mentioned about there being the fact that you can order something, it shows up at your door, hopefully 2 days later, is because we have so many people. And yes, that's a way of functioning. But like, if at the same time if people love the convenience of that, and they have, and we can argue about that, whether that's a good thing or not. But if people love the convenience of that and are also okay with people who say that like depopulation is a great thing, then you're not going to be able to keep both of those things. And I mean, and it doesn't show up immediately in the same way that like cut flowers don't die immediately, but it does show up because people become more consistent. I've said this before, but like people very rarely totally change their minds, and societies in general very rarely change at a foundational level. Most of the time, what they do is they just become more consistent. And so they just follow their own argument. They just go in the direction they were already headed. So even if I've changed my mind, to use the term, it's usually that if I had a thought about, I don't know, if I had a thought about politics and somebody said, but don't you believe this over here? Then usually I would go, oh yeah, I guess I do. That is a deeper commitment that I have. But if people become more and more consistent with their deepest commitments, then for the left, that means like the end of humanity. And that's bad news. And again, we don't get to just rewind the tape, turn it back a little bit. And, there's always the great line from No Country for Old Men. I think it all started when people started stop saying sir and ma'am. So we can't just wait around for things to get really awful and say like, oh, somebody should do something about that. It does start with the loss of manners. It starts with the loss of normalcy, putting the grocery cart back, that kind of thing.
Well, and this
And
is sort
eventually,
of
like, yeah.
no,
And I was
sorry,
just going to
carry
say,
on.
eventually, yeah, like, I have a friend, Jake McAtee, who says, like, it is wild that for a lot of our lives, everybody knew to get off the airplane in the zipper method. Everybody just knew that. And then, like, obviously, maybe it's still happening in some places, and, you know, that's great. But that is an agreed upon thing that nobody has to talk about beforehand. They still have to talk about how to fasten the seatbelt, but they don't have to talk about, as we're getting out, this is how we're going to get out. But people, like, as more and more people sort of take advantage of that assumption, then yeah, the whole thing disappears, and it doesn't show up in the biggest way immediately. The flowers don't die immediately, and the prodigal son didn't run out of money on the first day.
Well, it reminds me very much of junk DNA, right? And this is kind of old science. It's been a while. But
Yeah.
there was this idea that, like a vast percentage of your DNA is junk DNA. It's not being used. So some aspiring scientists basically reached into a mouse and pulled out that junk DNA. And it worked for one generation. And then the next generation were these like Cronenberg horrors. And they were like, oh, well, I don't exactly know what went wrong, but that was supposed to do something.
Right.
And I think what you saw,
Right.
in particularly in the 1960s, right, was this idea that we could shed these social bonds and it'll be fine. And for that generation, it largely has been. Obviously, there were a number of people who had their lives ruined. I'm not discounting that. But they weren't really stuck with consequences the way their children were. And obviously, I'm not talking about every baby boomer, but take something like the sexual revolution, right? Baby boomers were involved in the sexual revolution. Many of them, got married once, then divorced. But largely speaking, they effectively lived once they kind of sowed their wild oats like their parents did. But let's look at Gen X, right? The children of divorce. Let's look at millennials. Let's look at Gen Z. Those flowers died. Believe me, they died. But it took a generation or two. And so I think what we're in now, right, is we are downstream of umpteen number of dead flowers. Things that worked for a little bit. And we just assumed, well, it worked for 2 years, it worked for 5 years, it worked for 10. Therefore, this is a solid foundation to build on. And that's really not the case. And so again, you hear people who are to our left talking about this desire to return to the 90s. And we've been punching around that idea this entire hour. And just to add kind of one final kick on a dead horse is it's like that was not before the decline. That's midway through. I would argue not even midway, but it is, that process had already started, and you can't freeze decline like that. It's not how, if you ever, worked with metal, right? You don't paint over rust. It still goes along, if you're not paying attention to it. And so just as we sort of bring this to a close, do you have any kind of, given this premise, right? Given everything you've said about politicization, what is your kind of charge for the listener, right? For the man sitting at home?
Yeah, I think that the basic difference between people who can recognize friend and enemy and people who can't is an important one. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person for recognizing that it's going on. And it doesn't matter what the enemy says about you. So if the enemy says, no, he started the fight, and oh no, I was just punching back, then that doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what he says. You have to just know in your heart and know in your conscience that that's the right thing to do. The foundational thing, if this really is, if politics really is about preserving a way of life, the best thing that anybody could do, whether they're able to preserve that or not, is to build something that's worth preserving. So, and all the while knowing that losing is not reputation. So you didn't, it's not some indictment on your position or on the thing that you built, whether it succeeds or fails, or whether you were doing the right thing in the meantime. And so optimism, pessimism about the future becomes something that it shouldn't stop you from, again, building like locally a way of life that you would like to have preserved. Because you don't want at the end of it all to just have to be offering excuses for, well, why didn't you push the ball forward at all? Or why didn't you hold them back at all? You don't want to be answering your kids those questions like that. And you don't want your kids to, you want your kids or the next generation to be further along and to be better off. Like, okay, I held as much as I could, and I think I got the ball forward a little bit. I pushed it. And that's so if you don't recognize you're in a game, so back like we'll turn from war to football. If you don't recognize you're in a football game and there's an opposing team, then you're not going to resist, and you're also not going to push anything forward, and which is really unkind to your people. It's really unkind to your descendants. And so like, it's not, Schmidt is not talking about the way he wishes things were. Why we take it that way is because we're used to people talking about politics that way. But again, recognizing you're in a fight means that you can start fighting, or recognize to make it less violent. If you recognize you're in a football game, then you can start getting the ball down the field, or at least holding the other guys back.
And I think in addition to that, I'll just add one more thing, is that stop looking to your enemies for moral legitimation, right? Stop looking to them for approval, because you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't ask your opponents in a football game, what they think of your playbook, right? It's right, ridiculous to even say it. And so, again, I just want to reiterate that, this might be tough love, but it's necessary, right? And it's necessary because we want to see people like us win. And to be honest, I think we're pretty tired of losing.
Yeah.
So Wade.
Yeah, and one last point. I'm just jumping on, but once you recognize you're in a war, it's possible to do that in a really fun way. So I always point to the example of Robin Hood, where it's like, just because you're in a fight doesn't mean you have to be have your stiff neck and brow furrowed. Like, you can have fun fighting, and fighting real enemies who are a real threat to your life and who have put you in really awful situations. And what's attractive about Robin Hood is the same thing that makes him effective. It's because he's above it and has goals within it. So don't think that, like, if I recognize the friend enemy distinction, I'm going to be really hard to be around, or nobody's going to want to talk politics with me because I always recognize the severity of everything. But like Robin Hood, again, fictional stuff, but like Robin Hood recognized how bad things were. It's not that he was deceived into thinking things were fine, but that was what gave him the power to be able to thumb his nose at the king, be disrespectful, and laugh the whole time. So again, it actually frees you to act if you are recognizing what we're doing here, that we're not a debate club. This is a real fight, but we can have a ton of fun in the fight.
I think that's well said, Wade. So if people want to find more of you and more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I make The Wade Show with Wade. I put that on YouTube. Channel is just called The Wade Show with Wade. And then I'm on Twitter at Wade Stotts, Stotts. And we also put our videos up on Canon Plus. So that's our sort of bet against any kind of censorship or anything like that. So mycanonplus.com. And if anybody wants to support the show and get access to Canon Plus, I do have a promo code WADE99 that gets your first month for 99 cents if anybody wants to do that. But yeah, if people are just looking for a good introduction, follow me on Twitter, Wade Stotts, and then Wade Show with Wade on YouTube.
And I'll make sure to link to all of those things, as well as the video that we have been referencing, because it is quite good. I highly recommend it, and I think everyone should listen to it. If you want to support me, you can find the show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack. I promise I will update it again soon. I just have not had anything to say, and so I have not written anything down. That is my one excuse. If you want to support us more directly, you can do that by checking out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Solid brand. JD's a good dude. Highly recommend their services. And again, Wade, this was a great time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, man.
And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.